Sarah Kim was drowning. Her life was a never-ending cycle of unpaid bills, student loans, and dead-end jobs. She had spent the last few years working at small offices, waitressing in the evenings, and trying to keep her family from falling apart. So when she got the email from Blackthorn Enterprises, offering her a personal secretary position under CEO William Blackthorn, it felt like fate had finally given her a break. Blackthorn? Her best friend Mia had said, eyes wide. The William Blackthorn? The billionaire who never smiles? You're going to be working for him? Sarah hadn't thought much about it then. A job was a job, but when she stepped into the massive glass skyscraper on her warm first day, she felt an uneasy thrill rush down her spine. The office was silent, efficient, intimidating. Employees whispered about their boss, the man who fired people on, a whim, who never attended social events, who never let a secretary last more than 6 months. And then she met him. She had expected cold professionalism. Instead, when she entered his office, she found herself drowning in his gaze. William Blackthorn was staring at her. Tall, immaculate suit. Dark, unreadable eyes that didn't just look at her, but through her. "You're late," he said, his voice calm, but heavy with authority. Sarah's breath hitched. I got lost. That won't happen again," he interrupted smoothly. "Sit down." She obeyed, pulse racing. Something about him unnerved her. Not just his presence, but the way he was watching her. As if he knew something she didn't. The slow burn tension and the elevator scene. At first, William was cold and unreadable. Sarah's job was simple. Answer his calls, schedule his meetings, and be available at all times. But things started to shift. The late nights. One evening, she fell asleep at her desk. When she woke up, she wasn't at her desk anymore. She was in his office, wrapped in a warm blanket. Her head snapped up. The office was dim, the city lights glowing through the glass windows. "You should go home," came a all-slow voice from behind her. She turned to find William standing near the window, his hands in his pockets, watching the rain. "Did you carry me here?" she asked, startled. He didn't answer. Immediately. "You work hard," he finally said. "Too hard." And then, before she could say anything else, he walked away. The elevator incident and the moment of tension. A week later, they were trapped in an elevator together when the power went out. The air felt thick, charged. The moment the lights flickered off, Sarah froze. Her hands tightened into fists as she pressed herself against the cool elevator wall. Her breathing became uneven, shallow. "Sarah?" William's voice was calm, but his sharp gaze didn't miss the way her body had gone stiff. The walls felt like they were closing in. Her heartbeat pounded painfully in her ears. She barely managed to whisper, I can't breathe." William moved immediately, stepping closer. "Sarah, look at me." She was spiraling. Visions of a more small, dark room from her childhood. A locked door. No way out. A warm, firm hand cupped her face. "Breathe with me," he commanded softly. "In." She gasped, trying to follow his lead. "Good. Now out." His hand was steady against her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin, soothingly. "I won't let anything happen to you," he murmured. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but his presence anchored her. She clenched his jacket, trembling. "I hate small, dark spaces." "I know," he said. "You're safe. You're not alone." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was their breathing, synchronized, intimate. Then she felt it. the shift in the air. His thumb brushed against her bottom lip, his touch feather-light, sending shivers down her spine. His breath was warm against her cheek, dangerously close. It was slow, painfully slow. A test, a warning, a temptation. His lips barely brushed hers, lingering, teasing. But before he could kiss her, Sarah pulled away sharply, her hands pressing against his chest. No. Her voice was firm this time. I'm not like other girls who throw themselves at you just because you're rich and handsome. For a moment, William was silent. Then, his lips curved slightly. A smirk. So, Sarah, you find me handsome? His tone was teasing, playful. But his eyes held something darker. She ungasped, flustered. She didn't know how to respond. Just then, the elevator doors opened with a ding. Without another word, she stepped out, leaving William standing alone, his ego unbruised for the first time in years. The forbidden affair begins. William, for the first time, couldn't get a woman out of his mind. Sarah, on the other hand, refused to fall for his charm. Every flirtation, every attempt to get closer, she rejected. But William was not a man who accepted defeat. He found ways to get under her skin. You seem distracted, Sarah. His voice was low as he leaned over her desk. You're spending too much time avoiding me, he murmured when he accidentally trapped her against the filing cabinets, but Sarah never caved. She kept her distance, until one night, when something changed. A dangerous proposition. Sarah had been resisting him for months. Each time William made his intentions clear, she pushed him away, determined not to let him manipulate her. But she couldn't escape the growing tension between them, the pull that seemed to magnetize her toward him, despite everything she knew about him. The dangerous power, the coldness, and the obsession that burned beneath the surface. One night, as Sarah was about to leave the office, William called her into his office again. I need you to stay late tonight, he said, his tone more commanding than usual. I have a project I need you to assist with. His voice was colder than she had ever heard it, but there was something else, an underlying heat. Sarah hesitated, looking at the clock on the wall. It was already past 10, but she couldn't say no. Not to him. I'll be right there, she said, steeling herself for whatever he had planned. The proposition. Sarah entered his office, the room bathed in the dim glow of the desk lamp. William was standing by the window, his back to her. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. I've been thinking, William began, his voice as smooth as velvet but carrying a weight that made Sarah uneasy. You've been avoiding me for months, Sarah. Why is that? She swallowed hard, her pulse picking up. She had always been careful around him, careful to keep her guard up. Because I don't trust you, she replied, her voice steady despite the nerves writhing in her stomach. He turned to face her then, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah saw something raw in his eyes. A darkness, a need, but something more. A frustration. You think you can resist me forever? William asked, his voice a whisper that slid through her like smoke. I've watched you, Sarah. I know you feel it too. Her breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let him see her falter. I'm not interested in your games, William. He took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Not interested in me? His lips twitched upward. I think you're lying. Sarah took a step back, heart racing. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William stepped closer, towering over her. I want everything. Before she could react, he closed the gap between them, his hand brushing the side of her face, his fingers grazing her cheek as if testing the waters. The touch was soft, but it sent a shock through her. She wanted to pull away, but the intensity in his eyes held her in place. "I want your trust, Sarah," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "I want you to stop resisting. You know you can't fight this. You can't fight me." He paused, his gaze darkening with something almost predatory. "But I'll make you an offer." Sarah frowned, confused. "An offer?" William smirked, his hand trailing down to her neck, his thumb gently caressing her skin. "Yes, if you want out of this game, I'll let you walk away. You can leave Blackthorn Enterprises, go back to your normal life. I'll even help you with your bills, your student loans." Her mind spun at the mention of her debts, the crushing weight of them that had followed her for years. It was tempting, but she refused to let her desperation control her. "And if I stay?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "If you stay..." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Then I'll make you mine." Her heart skipped a beat, her body reacting to the heat of his words despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. She had never been this close to him, never felt his presence consume her so entirely. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she found herself drawn to him, her pulse thundering in her ears. She wanted to say no, but part of her, the part she was afraid to admit, wanted him too. The crossing point, the days that followed, were a blur. Sarah was no longer sure if she was fighting against him or fighting against herself. William's presence in her life grew more suffocating, his attention more intense. Every glance, every touch, felt like it was pulling her closer to the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Then one night, after an emotionally charged meeting that had left her on edge, William asked her to meet him again. "Come to my penthouse," he said, his voice low and compelling. "I'll show you what happens when you stop resisting." Sarah hesitated. She knew she was dangerously close to crossing a line she couldn't return from, but something deep within her was ready to surrender. "Continue. You can continue, but change the cart we. She stays in the company because she's sure she does not want William. She says she'll accept the money and leave the company." But this was not the answer William wanted Sue. Sarah was not sure how much longer she could resist the tension between them. The moments she spent near William felt suffocating, pulling her in despite her best efforts. The connection they shared, dark and intense, terrified her. She didn't want to be just another conquest, a toy in his game. So when he made his proposition, she thought long and hard about it. She took a deep breath, standing tall despite the fluttering in her chest. "I'll take the money," she said, her voice firm. "Help me with my student loans, my debts. I'll leave Blackthorn Enterprises. I'll walk away from all of this." William's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, but he didn't immediately speak. He merely stared at her with that same unsettling intensity. Sarah tried to ignore the nervous quiver in her stomach. This was the logical choice, the only choice. She wasn't going to fall for him. Not now. Not ever. But his silence was unnerving. "Leave?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous, a cold edge cutting through the calm facade he had mastered. Sarah nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, I'll take the money, the freedom." For a long, tense moment, William didn't move, his gaze never leaving her. The silence between them felt like a thick fog, heavy with unspoken words. Then, with a calculated step, he moved closer to her, his presence wrapping around her like an inescapable force. "That's your choice?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes." Sarah didn't back down, even though her heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears. "I'm not going to stay here, tied to someone who only sees me as another challenge. I don't want anything to do with you." His eyes flared with something darker, something possessive. "Is that what you really think? You're just another challenge to me?" His tone was icy, but underneath, there was something far more dangerous. His gaze darkened, the depth of his obsession seeping into every word he spoke. Sarah swallowed, but her resolve remained firm. "Yes, I'm not interested in your games, William. I've seen enough to know what kind of man you are." He stood still for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a swift movement, he closed the distance between them, his hand gripping her wrist with a force that startled her. "You really think you can walk away from me that easily?" His words were barely a whisper, but they held a terrifying edge. "You think you can just take my money and leave?" She tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. The coldness in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. "I'm giving you a choice, Sarah," he said slowly, his voice low and calm. "But if you think I'll just let you leave, you're wrong." Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and confusion flooding her chest. I don't want anything to do with you," she stammered. William's lips curled into a small, bitter smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have to want anything from me to be mine." Her breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, suffocating her. He was no longer offering her an escape. He was offering her a different kind of game. "I won't be your toy, William," she said, her voice breaking through the tension. "I'll leave with the money, and that will be the end of it." His expression shifted, the facade of cold professionalism cracking for just a moment. "You think I'd let you go that easily?" His voice was a low growl, and the heat in his eyes was palpable. "No, I'm not going to let you walk out of here with your head held high. Not when you've started something you can't finish." Sarah froze, the realization dawning on her. She had no idea what she was dealing with. This wasn't a man who let people walk away. This wasn't about the money or the job. This was about control, and she was about to lose everything. The breaking point. William took another step forward, closing the space between them. She could feel the heat radiating off of him, the raw power of his presence pushing her back into the corner of the office. "You've made a mistake, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice dangerously soft. She tried to stand her ground, but his eyes were too intense, his aura too overpowering. She had thought she could control this situation, but now it felt as if she were caught in a web, and the more she struggled, the tighter it became. "I told you I'm not like other women," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and fear. "You can't make me want you." William's lips twisted into a dark smirk. "Oh, but I already have," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "You just don't realize it yet." Without warning, he closed the final gap between them, his hand brushing against her cheek as he leaned in, his lips hovering dangerously close to hers. The air around them crackled with tension, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "I've been patient with you, Sarah," he whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "But I don't play by your rules, and you'll learn that the hard way." His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her neck, his grip firm as he pulled her toward him. She gasped, her pulse racing, her mind screaming at her to push him away. But it was too late. He had her trapped. His lips found hers in a kiss that was not gentle, not hesitant. It was forceful, demanding, like he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. The kiss was a flood of heat and intensity, completely overwhelming her. Sarah's hands shook as they pressed against his chest, torn between resisting and giving in. This wasn't the answer she had expected. This wasn't the clean break she had imagined. But as his kiss deepened and his hands slid around her waist, pulling her even closer, she realized something. There was no walking away from this. No easy escape. The forbidden union begins. Continued. The Chi. Kiss was everything she feared, everything she tried to avoid. It was rough, demanding, and completely overwhelming. Sarah's body tensed as his lips moved against hers with a desperation that made her skin crawl. She shoved him back, the force of her push enough to break the contact, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She wiped her mouth, as if trying to erase the taste of him from her lips, her hands shaking with anger and disgust. "What the hell is wrong with you?" She spat, glaring at him. You kissed me without my permission." William's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he stepped closer again, towering over her. "You think I care about permission, Sarah?" His voice was calm, but the dark edge in it made her stomach tighten. "I've never had to ask for anything. I'm not like the others," Sarah shot back, her voice thick with fury. "You can't control me, William. You can't just take what you want. I'm not some toy you can kiss when you feel like it." The anger in her chest burned brighter with each word. How dare he treat her like that? Like she was nothing but an object for his twisted amusement. Her body was hers, and no one had the right to make her feel small, to make her feel powerless, least of all him. William's lips twitched, the faintest smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. But there was no warmth in it, only something darker. "You're right about one thing," he said, his tone cutting through the air. "You're not like the others. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you go just because you say so." She shook her head, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on her. She had always known William Blackthorne was dangerous, but now it was painfully clear just how far he would go to get what he wanted. She took a step back, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'm leaving. I'll take your money and I'll walk away from this whole nightmare. I don't care what you do, or how much power you think you have. I'm not staying." William's eyes flashed with something dark, something that made the air between them feel thick with tension. "You think I'll let you walk away that easily?" he repeated, his voice icy, yet full of a quiet rage. "I don't let people leave, Sarah. Not when they belong to me." "Don't you dare say that," she hissed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I don't belong to anyone, least of all you. I'm not your possession, and I never will be." William's gaze softened, but only for a fraction of a second. It was a fleeting look, quickly masked by a cold, calculating expression. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already in this whether you like it or not. You've been mine since the moment you walked into this office." The words hit her like a slap, and Sarah felt a wave of revulsion wash over her. How could he think that? How could he be so delusional? She was a person, not a prize to be claimed, and no matter how much he tried to manipulate her, she wasn't going to give in. "I'll never be yours," she spat, shaking her head. "You've crossed a line, William, and I'm done." Without another word, she turned and stormed out of his office, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her, heavy and possessive, like a brand searing into her skin, the consequences of defiance. For the next few days, Sarah avoided William at all costs. She worked tirelessly, kept her head down, and stayed out of his way. She was determined to prove that she could walk away, that she could remain untouched by him, no matter what he tried. But as the days wore on, the tension between them grew more unbearable. William was everywhere, his presence lurking in every corner of the office, his cold gaze always finding her, no matter where she went. He was like a shadow, always there, always watching. And then, one evening, just when Sarah thought she had a moment of peace, she received another email from him. It was simple, direct, and chilling. "Meet me in my office." Now. Her heart skipped a beat. She could already feel the weight of his command, the gravity of his authority pressing down on her. but she refused to show him any weakness. She walked into his office, head held high, every step filled with the determination not to let him break her. William stood by the window, his back to her. The city lights outside cast long shadows across the room, but he seemed unaffected by the darkness surrounding him. When he turned to face her, his eyes locked onto hers, cold and unreadable. "You think you can run from me, Sarah?" he asked, his voice as smooth and controlled as ever. "You think you can escape me just because you walk away? That's not how this works." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "I don't want anything to do with you," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not interested in your games, your manipulations. I'm leaving, William, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." He took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to make that decision. I decide what happens to you, not the other way around." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had been afraid of this moment, afraid that he would never let her go. But she couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had done. "You'll never have control over me," she said, her voice filled with a mix of defiance and fury. "Not now, not ever." William stood there for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the distance between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch burning her skin despite the coldness in his eyes. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice filled with something dark and possessive. "You're mine, and I will make you understand that, whether you like it or not." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. But she refused to let him win. She turned her face away from his touch, her eyes blazing with hatred. "I hate you," she whispered fiercely, her voice breaking as the anger and hurt flooded her chest. "And I will never be yours." "Okay, it's great. Continue, but the girl should tell him that she wants to resign, and she doesn't even want his money. If he wouldn't give her resignation, she would leave just like that. It's better than seeing him every day. And after she gets home, she cries a lot thinking about paying her bills, so she starts looking for jobs, but no one accepts her despite her experience and hard work. Is William behind this? And what does William do when Sarah wants to resign? Does he accept? Or when she doesn't come back to work anymore? What does he do? You can create this part from your own ideas. Sarah couldn't do this anymore. Every day, the weight of William's gaze, the tension between them, the power he wielded over her, it was suffocating. She had tried to resist, to stand her ground, but now her resolve was shattering. She sat at her desk, staring at the screen in front of her, her hands trembling. The flickering cursor on her resignation letter was the only thing keeping her from losing it. Her mind raced as she typed out her decision, but each word felt like an anchor pulling her down deeper into a sea of hopelessness. "Dear Mr. Blackthorne, I am resigning from my position effective immediately. I cannot continue working under these conditions, and I believe it is in both our best interest that I leave the company. I will not accept any severance, and I ask that you please process my resignation without further delay." She clicked send. With that, it was done. She had given up. The idea of walking into that office and seeing his cold, calculating eyes again was too much to bear. If she couldn't get away from him, she'd find a way to break free entirely. But William wasn't done with her. When William saw the resignation email, a wave of anger surged through him. He had expected her to be difficult, but not to simply walk away like this. He had tried to break her, yes, but he hadn't anticipated her to give up so easily. His pride, his sense of control, everything about him screamed to not let this happen. That evening, he waited for her at the office, long after the sun had set. The dim lights reflected off the glass walls, casting shadows across the sleek furniture. He stood there waiting, his jaw clenched. Sarah had left for the day, but her Resignation email had sent a cold rage through him. He couldn't understand it. Couldn't understand why she would leave him when he was so sure of his power over her. Sarah's struggles at home. When Sarah arrived home, she felt the crushing weight of her decision. She had given up a good job, yes, but what did that matter when it felt like everything else was slipping through her fingers? The rent was due in a week. Her student loans had gone unpaid for months. She had bills stacked up, unopened, because the stress of it all made it too overwhelming to deal with. Without the steady income from Blackthorn Enterprises, she was trapped. Sarah sat on her couch, staring at the bills in front of her, her fingers trembling as she opened one envelope after another. The reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her gasping for air. Her thoughts turned dark. How was she going to make ends meet now? She had worked tirelessly at Blackthorn, but nothing had prepared her for this. No job would take her, no matter how much experience she had, no matter how hard she worked. Her resume wasn't enough. She had always been overlooked, always fighting to stay afloat. But now, with no way forward, the despair was suffocating. In a panic, she began looking for new opportunities. The internet was full of job listings, but as she sent out resume after resume, each rejection email chipped away at her confidence. "Sorry, we're moving forward with another candidate. We regret to inform you. At this time, your qualifications do not meet the needs of our company." Hours passed, and Sarah sat there, staring at the screen, unable to stop the tears that had started to fall. It wasn't just about the bills anymore. It was about the crushing sense of failure that weighed down on her chest. She had given up everything to get away from him, and now she felt more trapped than ever. William's pursuit back at the office. William paced restlessly. He had sent a few messages to Sarah after receiving her resignation, but she hadn't responded. A part of him told him to let it go. She wanted to walk away, fine, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something else at play. She couldn't just disappear. She wouldn't. His obsession with her was something he had never fully acknowledged until now. He didn't understand why she mattered so much, why her defiance, her refusal to be his, had become an ache he couldn't ignore. The next morning, he waited for Sarah to return to work. When she didn't show up, he knew something had shifted. He tried calling her again, but there was no answer. And then, he took matters into his own hands. Sarah's final stand 2 days later, after a sleepless night spent agonizing over her finances, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, overwhelmed by exhaustion. She was starting to lose hope. She hadn't heard from William or anyone else from the company. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe she shouldn't have been so hasty, so proud. The doorbell rang. She opened the door, and there, standing in the doorway, was William. His tall frame filled the entrance, his expression unreadable, the usual coldness in his eyes replaced by something else, something darker. "What do you want, William?" Sarah snapped, trying to keep her voice steady, but the crack in it betrayed her. He didn't speak right away, his gaze scanning her disheveled appearance, the bags under her eyes, the way she stood in the doorway like she had nowhere else to go. "I gave you the space you wanted," William said, his voice low and measured. "But you're not getting away from me that easily." Sarah stepped back, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "I am getting away from you. I've already quit. I'm not coming back." His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. He took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You don't get to make that decision, Sarah," he said quietly. "I'm not letting you walk away just because you're afraid of what's between us." Sarah recoiled, backing up toward the living room. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm done. I don't need your money. I don't need anything from you. I'm done playing your games." William's expression hardened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might lash out. But instead, his eyes softened, just a little, as if considering something. He moved past her into the apartment, his presence filling the space. "You think I don't know what you're going through?" he said, his voice soft but edged with something cold. "You think you can survive without me? Without my help? I won't let you suffer for something I started." Sarah's heart raced. "I didn't." "Ask for your help," she snapped, wiping away a tear. "I just want to get out of this mess, away from you." William stood there for a long moment, watching her. "You'll come back," he said finally, his voice low and certain. "You'll come back, to me, or I'll make sure you don't make it out there on your own. I'll ensure no one hires you." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The trap tightens as Sarah stood there, struggling to breathe. She realized she had never truly escaped him. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, she was still trapped. She was fighting to be free. But every move she made felt like she was being pulled back into his world. His power. Sarah collapsed on her couch, her knees buckling beneath her as she crumpled into herself. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. The weight of everything that had happened, everything she had tried to escape, crushed her. William was standing just inside her apartment, his gaze intense and unyielding. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since he entered. But she felt the full force of his presence. It was like a storm waiting to break, and she couldn't handle it anymore. Her chest ached as the tears spilled down her face, and she looked up at him, pleading. "Please," she sobbed, her voice raw with desperation. "Please just leave me alone. There's nothing between us. Nothing. You're just a nightmare I can't wake up from." She wiped her eyes furiously, but it didn't stop the tears from flowing. "I already have enough stress in my life," she continued, her voice cracking with pain. "I've been drowning in bills, in debt, in worry, and now you..." She choked on her words, her heart breaking under the weight of it all. "Why can't you just let me go? Why can't you just leave me alone? Why can't you find another challenge? Why me?" Her sobs filled the silence between them, the sound of her despair, hitting William harder than he ever expected. His face remained cold, unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something almost like frustration, though it was quickly masked. He stepped closer to her, but Sarah didn't want him near. She recoiled, her hands pushing weakly against the air as if she could push him away like she could push away the entire world. "William, please," she gasped between sobs. "I can't take it anymore. You're making my life a living hell. Every day, your face, your eyes are following me. Everything I do, everything I think, you're there. You're always there. And I just can't breathe. It's too much. Please let me go." Her voice was so broken, so full of pain, it felt like a sharp blade cutting through the silence. Her hands trembled as she wiped her face, unable to stop herself from shaking. I can't live like this anymore. I swear to God, William," she whispered, her breath hitching. "If you don't let me go, I'll kill myself. I won't make it. I'm already at the end of my rope. I can't live with this. I can't take it anymore." The words felt like a knife in her chest as soon as she said them, but they were the truth. She was broken. She didn't know how much more of his obsession, his suffocating control, she could endure. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face, pleading, "I just want to be free. Please let me go." William's reaction. William froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood there silent, his face devoid of emotion. but inside, his thoughts were spiraling. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to process what she had just said. He had never seen her like this. Weak, broken, desperate. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to break. He had pushed her to the edge, yes, but he hadn't wanted this. But as he looked at her, the words she had spoken repeated in his mind. He had heard them. Heard her threaten him. Threaten to end it all just to escape from him. From what he was doing to her. The reality of his obsession, his need to control, to possess, hit him hard. He stepped forward again, but Sarah shrank back. "I never meant for this," William said, his voice hoarse, though he was careful to keep his composure. But Sarah didn't care about the subtlety in his voice. She didn't care about his intentions anymore. She couldn't. "You think this is a game?" She spat through her tears. "You think this is some challenge for you? To break me, to control me, to make me fall for you?" She shook her head, her hands clutching at her chest as if trying to hold herself together. "I'm not a game, William. I'm not a challenge for you to conquer. I'm a person, and you've ruined my life." William's face darkened. The idea that Sarah saw herself as nothing but a game, a challenge to be won, cut deeper than anything she could have imagined. "You think you're more than that, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low, dangerously calm. "You think this is just about you? Just about your little life? You're wrong. You're mine, whether you like it or not. And you'll learn that eventually." He wasn't sure why the words stung. Why the idea of her rejecting him, of her leaving him behind like a meaningless part of her life, cut into him so deeply. It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Sarah's face twisted with rage, with pain. "You are nothing but a monster," he stepped back. No. He wasn't a monster. He was William Blackthorne. And Sarah would see that. She would understand Sarah's last stand. Sarah cried, her body trembling with exhaustion. She realized she couldn't keep going like this. She couldn't keep begging him, couldn't keep pleading for him to let her go when he was so determined to keep her. It was exhausting. It was breaking her. Her breaths were shallow now, and her hands were shaking violently. She felt like she was being crushed under the weight of her own emotions, her own helplessness. "Why are you so obsessed with me?" she whispered, through her tears, her voice cracking. "Why can't you just leave me alone? You have everything. You have power. Why can't I just be free? Why does it have to be me?" But William's face remained stoic, unreadable. "You're not just anyone," he said, his tone dangerously calm. "You're the one who resisted. You're the one who doesn't belong to me. And that makes you more than just a challenge, Sarah." She froze. "What do you mean?" she whispered, trembling. William's lips curled into a small, twisted smile, but there was nothing kind in it. "You've been more than a challenge. You're my obsession, and now, you'll never leave." The consequences of defiance. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah could feel the air thick with tension, her chest tight with fear and anger. Every word, every emotion had poured out of her. And still, William stood there, unwavering, like a force of nature she couldn't escape. Her entire body trembled, not just from the fear of him, but from the crushing weight of exhaustion. She had already given everything. Her tears, her pain, her last desperate attempts to break free. But he didn't let her go. He refused. "You'll never leave, Sarah," he repeated, his words cold, but with an undercurrent of something darker. "I'll make sure of it." She wanted to scream, to hit him, but her body wouldn't obey. Her hands were weak, trembling at her sides as she stared at him, feeling so small, so utterly trapped. "I don't want you," she whispered, her voice raw. "I never wanted this. I never asked for any of this. I just want to live. I want my life back." William stepped closer, his presence closing in on her like a storm. "And you will have your life, Sarah," he said softly, his voice now laced with an eerie calm. "Just not the way you want it." Her heart skipped a beat as the implications of his words settled in. "No," she gasped, instinctively stepping back. But William grabbed her wrist with a force so gentle it almost felt worse, like he was holding her there, not to hurt her, but to keep her locked in his grip. "You won't run from me anymore," he said, his tone dark and final. The next few days felt like an endless loop of dread and despair. Sarah didn't go back to work. She couldn't bring herself to face him. The thought of being in that office, of seeing his eyes on her, the way he loomed over her every move, it made her physically ill. She didn't have the strength to go back. She was done. She knew she had to leave, but William wasn't giving her an option. Not anymore. By the time night fell, she had barely moved from the couch, her phone lifeless in her hand, as if she had exhausted every possibility, every option she could think of. But then, there was a knock at her door. When Sarah opened it, she froze. It was William. Of course it was. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and before she could protest, he closed the door behind him, his shadow filling the room. "I told you, Sarah," he said softly, his voice low and unwavering. "You're mine." His gaze was piercing, unnerving, and it made her stomach twist with disgust. But she wouldn't show him her weakness again. "I don't care," she spat, tears of frustration blurring her vision. "You can't control me, William. You can't. I won't let you." "You don't get to decide that," he whispered, his voice like a dark promise. "You never did. You think you can just walk away from me, from everything I've done for you? You think I'll let you ruin everything we've built?" The coldness in his words sent a chill down her spine. "You've already ruined it," she whispered back, her voice hoarse. "I'm not your project. I'm not your toy." But as she spoke, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't just control anymore. It was desperation. A need. And it terrified her. "Don't say that," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "You have no idea what you mean to me, Sarah. You have no idea how far I will go to make you mine." The words stung like a slap across her face, the weight of his obsession pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, drowning her in a sea of guilt and fear. Sarah's last stand, the ultimate choice. But Sarah, despite everything, despite the crushing weight of his gaze, refused to give in. She wasn't a pawn in his game. She wasn't going to let him break her. "I'll leave," she said, the words cold and final. "And if you don't let me go, I'll leave anyway. I'll disappear. I'll make sure of it. You can't control me forever, William." A flicker of something, anger, perhaps, or pain, crossed his face, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "You won't leave me, Sarah," he said, his voice icy. "You're not strong enough. You can't do it. You're mine. And if you think you can run from me, you're wrong. You'll be back. They always come back." His eyes held her in place, his words like chains. But she didn't back down. She didn't move. "Try me," she said through gritted teeth, her voice barely a whisper. The aftermath. Alone and broken, Sarah didn't go back to work the next day, and the day after that. Her life had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She spent every moment trying to ignore the looming thought of William in her head, but it never went away. For days, she searched for any sign of freedom. Job interviews, calls to family, desperate searches through every job listing she could find. but nothing. It was as if the entire world was against her. No one would hire her. No one would take her in. She felt like she was being suffocated, trapped not only by William but by her own circumstances. And as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder, was this all William's doing? It was the only explanation that made sense. William's final move days passed. Sarah didn't see him again, didn't hear from him. She thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally managed to escape. But then, one evening, as she was about to lock up and go to bed, she received a single message. It was from William. It was simple, and it was chilling. "I'll always find you, Sarah." She stared at the screen, a cold shiver running down her spine. He hadn't let her go. He never would. Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone as she read William's message. Again, "I'll always find you, Sarah." Her stomach twisted violently, nausea rising in her throat. She wanted to scream, throw her phone across the room, pretend that this wasn't happening, but she knew better. She knew William Blackthorne was a man who never made empty threats. She had tried to escape. She had tried to fight. But no matter what she did, he was still there, lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings of her life like a puppet master. She couldn't get a job. Every potential employer suddenly lost interest the moment she applied, as if she had been blacklisted from every respectable company in the city. Her bills were piling up. Her landlord was growing impatient, and all roads led back to him. Sarah felt the tears welling in her eyes again. She was tired of crying, tired of feeling powerless. But how could she fight when William had already taken everything from her? Her hands trembled as she typed out a reply. "Sarah, what do you want from me?" Seconds passed. Then her phone vibrated with his response. "William, you know what I want." Her breath hitched. She gritted her teeth, fingers tightening around the device. "He wants me to crawl back to him, over my dead body." Sarah switched off her phone and threw it onto the couch. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to push away the overwhelming dread clawing at her chest. "I won't let him win. I won't go back. I can't." But deep down, she knew the truth. William had already won. Cornered, 3 days passed. Sarah barely ate. She barely slept. The anxiety was eating her alive. Every time she stepped outside, she felt like eyes were watching her. She double-checked the locks on her doors, drew the curtains shut, and ignored the ringing of her phone when unknown numbers called. And then, on the 4th day, she opened her mailbox and froze. Inside was a single letter. No return address. Just her name, written in elegant, familiar handwriting. Williams. Her heart pounded as she tore it open, unfolding the crisp paper with shaking hands. "Sarah, you can run. You can cry. You can fight me all you want. But the outcome will never change. You belong to me, and you will come back to me, one way or another." There was no signature, no threats, just a simple, chilling declaration. Sarah's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she clutched the letter. The room spun around her. This wasn't obsession. This was possession. She had never been free. A sob ripped from her throat as she crumpled the letter in her fists. No. She couldn't live like this. She wouldn't live like this. Her vision blurred with hot tears, her chest heaving as she whispered, to herself, "I need to leave. I need to disappear." She had no other choice. Even if she had to vanish off the face of the earth, she would find a way to escape him. William's fury. William Blackthorne was not a patient man. He had given Sarah time. He had let her think she had a choice, but her defiance had crossed a line. The moment his men informed him that Sarah was packing her things, his blood ran cold. She was actually trying to run. Fury simmered beneath his composed exterior as he stood in his penthouse office, staring out at the glittering city skyline. His fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey in his hand. Did she really think she could leave him? That she could disappear without consequence? She didn't understand. She never had. Sarah belonged to him, and if she wanted to run, then he would clip her wings himself, his jaw clenched. He set the whiskey glass down with a sharp clink and picked up his phone. "Find her," he ordered coldly, "and bring her back to me." This time, he wouldn't give her the chance to run. This time, he would make sure she never tried to leave again. The final escape attempt, Sarah didn't hesitate. She stuffed the last of her clothes into a duffel bag, hands trembling as she zipped it shut. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, a mixture of fear and desperation fueling her every move. She had to leave now. Every minute she stayed was a risk. William would come for her. She knew that. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the terrifying certainty in his words. "One way or another, you will come back to me." No, not this time. Sarah swung the bag over her shoulder and rushed to the door. She hesitated for only a second, listening, nothing but silence. Good. She stepped into the hallway, locked her apartment door behind her, and hurried down the stairs. The elevator was too risky. She wouldn't put it past William to have someone watching her. With each step, her breath grew shallower. She was running on pure adrenaline, her pulse erratic. Outside. Just get outside. She pushed through the exit and stepped into the cold night air. The street was quiet. Only a few cars parked along the curb. Her escape route was simple. She would take the subway to the bus station, buy a ticket anywhere, and disappear. No phone, no social media, no connections. She had cash saved. It wouldn't last forever, but it would be enough to start over. For the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope flickered in her chest. She could do this. She had to. But just as she took a step forward, her body froze. A sleek black car was parked across the street, and leaning against it, hands in his pockets, was William. Sarah's stomach dropped. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag. No. No. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to know. William pushed off the car and started walking toward her. She turned. She ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the street, lungs burning. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed distance. But she had barely made it half a block before strong hands grabbed her from behind. "Let me go," she screamed, thrashing against the grip. A deep voice murmured, "Don't fight." "Sarah." Panic surged through her. William's men. She kicked, twisted, anything to get free. "Sir," one of the men said, holding her struggling form with ease. William approached slowly, his face unreadable. Sarah gasped for breath, her eyes burning with fury and terror. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. "Just let me go. Why are you doing this?" William stopped in front of her, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Because you're mine," he said simply, her vision blurred with tears. "I don't want you. I never have. There was never anything between us. Why can't you just accept that?" His expression didn't change. "Because it's not true." Her heart clenched painfully. "It is true," she sobbed. "You don't love me, William. You just love owning me. You love the chase, the control. But I'm not some prize for you to win." William exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, as if her words tested his patience. But then, something in his gaze shifted. "You think I enjoy this?" he murmured, stepping closer. His voice was lower now, dangerous. "You think I wanted to become like this?" Sarah stared at him, tears streaking down her face. "You made yourself like this," she whispered. "And you're ruining me along with you." Something flickered in his expression, something almost like pain. But it vanished in an instant. "You don't understand," he murmured. Sarah laughed bitterly through her tears. "No, William, you don't understand." She took a shaky breath, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you don't let me go, I'll kill myself." His entire body tensed. Sarah's tears fell freely now, her chest heaving. "Is that what you want? Because I can't take it anymore. I can't take you anymore. You're everywhere, in my head, in my life, ruining everything. I just want peace. And if you won't give it to me, I'll find another way." A deadly silence followed. William's face was unreadable, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. His breathing was controlled, too controlled. Then he closed his eyes. Just for a moment, when he opened them again, something had changed. "Let her go," he ordered. Sarah's captor hesitated. "Sir, now." The grip on her arms released instantly. Sarah stumbled back, her breath ragged. She couldn't believe it. He was letting her go. Her wide, tear-filled eyes met his, searching for a trick, a trap. But there was nothing. William's jaw was tight, his gaze unreadable. "Leave then," he said, "if that's what you really want." Sarah's legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to take a step back. Then another. Then another. He didn't stop her. For the first time, he didn't stop her. She turned and ran. But as she disappeared down the dark street, William stood still, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Something like loss. Freedom. Or a lie. Sarah made it to the bus station. She bought a one-way ticket, and she left. For days she traveled, changing locations, switching hotels, erasing any trace of herself. And yet, she still felt his presence. No matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that William was still there, watching, waiting. And she couldn't escape the terrifying question lingering in her mind. Had she really won? Or had William just let her believe she had? The return of the obsession. Sarah had been free for 3 months, or at least that's what she told herself. She had changed her name, moved to a new city, and found a quiet job in a small bookstore, where no one asked questions. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A life without William Blackthorne's suffocating presence. Yet, even now, she still woke up in cold sweats, haunted by the memory of his gaze, his touch, his voice. She hadn't seen him, hadn't heard from him, but something inside her knew. He hadn't let her go. Not really. The first warning, it started with small things. One evening as she walked home, she felt it, that eerie sensation of being watched. She turned sharply, scanning the quiet street. Nothing, but her pulse wouldn't settle. A week later, she came home to find a single black rose resting on her doorstep. Her hands shook as she picked it up. No note. No sign of who left it. But she didn't need one. She already knew. She stepped inside, locked the door, and pressed her back against it, forcing herself to breathe. William had found her. But why hadn't he taken her yet? The thought sent a chill down her spine because he's waiting, watching, playing a game only he understands. She should run. But where? There was nowhere in the world William Blackthorne couldn't reach her. The breaking point one night, she stayed late at the bookstore, organizing shelves. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up. "Sorry, we're closed." "Hello, Sarah." The book in her hands slipped through her fingers, crashing to the floor, her entire body locked up. That voice. Slowly, she turned, and there he was. William stood just inside the shop, dressed in an immaculate black coat, hands in his pockets. He looked calm, as if he had all the time in the world. Sarah took a step back, gripping the nearest shelf for support. Her worst nightmare had walked right through the door. What are you doing here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. William tilted, his head slightly, studying her. "I waited," he murmured. "I gave you space. I let you play pretend." His dark eyes trailed over her. Her cheap bookstore uniform, the tiredness in her face, the small, quiet life she had built for herself. His lips curled just slightly. "But you don't belong here, Sarah." Her stomach twisted. "You don't get to decide that." His gaze sharpened. "Don't I?" She flinched as he took a step forward, instinctively backing away. He noticed. His jaw tightened. "You still think you can run," he murmured. "That I'll let you leave again." Sarah clenched her fists, her breath coming in shaky gasps. "You said I could go. You let me go." Something flickered in his expression, something almost like amusement. "And yet, here we are," he said softly. Tears burned in her eyes. "Please, William, please, just let me live my life. I don't want this. I don't want you." A long silence stretched between them. Then, he exhaled slowly. "You don't understand, do you?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Her chest heaved. "Understand what?" William's eyes darkened. "You don't get to leave me, Sarah." His words sent ice through her veins. Before she could move, his hand shot out, fingers gripping her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. Her breath caught. He was too close. 3 months, he murmured. 3 months. I let you have your fantasy. But enough is enough. She trembled. "No." "Yes." His voice was absolute. His thumb brushed against her bottom lip, slow, deliberate. "You should have known better, Sarah. You were never really free." She shook her head, her body paralyzed by fear and something even worse, the twisted thrill of his touch. "I told you before," he whispered. His lips barely ghosted over her ear. "You belong to me." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized the truth. She had never escaped. William Blackthorne had merely been waiting for the moment she would break. And now, she was his again. No more running. The unraveling Sarah should have screamed, should have fought. But as William's fingers gripped her chin, his dark gaze locking onto hers, something inside her snapped. Enough. For months, she had been running. For months, he had been chasing. And what had it gotten her? Nothing. William. Blackthorne was not a man she could escape. But what if she stopped trying? A dangerous thought slithered into her mind. What if, instead of running from him, she played the game? What if she let him believe he had won? Her body stopped trembling. Her breath slowed. And then, she did something William didn't expect. She relaxed. His thumb was still brushing against her lip, waiting for her usual resistance, her usual defiance. But this time she didn't pull away. Instead, she did the one thing that could throw him off balance. She leaned into his touch. William's entire body went rigid. For the first time, the predator looked caught off guard. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. He had spent so long pursuing her, breaking her walls, hunting her down. And yet, now, she stood before him calm, compliant, willing. It made no sense. He narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing?" Sarah looked up at him, her tear-streaked face smooth, expression unreadable. "You win," she whispered. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. William's grip on her chin tightened. His other hand came up, caging her against the bookshelf. "Say that again," he demanded, voice sharp, laced with suspicion. Sarah swallowed, down her revulsion, and let her lips curve into something soft. "You win, William," she repeated. "I give up." The moment the words left her lips, she felt his entire presence shift. His fingers twitched. His breathing slowed. He didn't believe her. Not yet. She needed to sell it. So she reached up, slowly, hesitantly, and placed her palm against his chest. His heart was pounding. That was her first victory. "You spent so long trying to prove I belong to you," she murmured, tilting her chin up. "So, take me then." A muscle in his jaw clenched. His eyes, those dark, obsessive eyes, searched hers for any sign of deception. "Do you think you can play me, Sarah?" His voice was dangerously low. A thrill of fear shot through her. "I'm not playing," she whispered. Another lie. She was playing, and she was going to win. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah had a plan, the masterpiece of lies. Sarah let William take her, not forcefully, not with anger. He wanted to own her? Fine. She let him hold her hand as he led her out of the bookstore. She let him tuck her into his car, his grip possessive. She let him take her back to his penthouse, the very place she had sworn she would never return to. But she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She let him believe she had given in. William, for all his intelligence, for all his control, he had never once seen this version of her. And that made him vulnerable. It was a gamble, a dangerous, terrifying gamble. But Sarah Kim had nothing left to lose. Because while William believed he had finally broken her, she was about to destroy him. The fall of a King William Blackthorne was no fool. As he guided Sarah through the doors of his penthouse, he watched her. Every breath, every twitch of her fingers, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. She was different, not broken, not defeated, but accepting. It should have made him feel victorious. Instead, it made his pulse tighten. Sarah had spent months running, clawing, fighting. She had screamed, cried, and begged for freedom. And now, just like that, she was his? Too easy. William never trusted things that came easy, but at the same time, he had never wanted anything more. She was here, in his home, his to keep, his to protect, his to own. His obsession finally in his grasp. So why did it feel like she was slipping through his fingers? The Queen's Gambit Sarah didn't sleep that night. William had led her into the master bedroom, watching her like a lion watching his prey. But when he moved to touch her, she had only whispered, "Not yet." And somehow, he had listened. Now as she lay in the oversized bed, staring at the ceiling, she could feel him nearby. Not touching her, but watching. Always watching. She had to move carefully. William wasn't an idiot. If he sensed even a hint of deception, he would never let her go again, which meant she had to make him trust her. Make him believe she wanted this. And once she had him completely blind with obsession, she would destroy him, because William Blackthorne might be the king of his world. But Sarah was going to be the queen who brought him to his knees. The art of manipulation. The next morning, Sarah played her role perfectly. She didn't flinch when William handed her a cup of coffee. She didn't resist when he placed his hand on her lower back, guiding her through the penthouse. She even let him tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. Each time, his gaze darkened with satisfaction. She was playing with fire. But fire could be controlled if you knew how to wield it. "Tell me something, Sarah," William murmured as he watched her eat breakfast. She looked up. "What? Why the change?" She blinked, feigning innocence. "Change?" His jaw flexed. "You hated me. You begged me to let you go. Now, suddenly you're here, compliant, accepting." He set down his coffee cup, leaning forward. "I don't believe in miracles." Sarah met his gaze evenly. Then, deliberately, she reached across the table and took his hand. William stilled. The air in the room shifted. "You were right," she whispered. His fingers twitched against hers. "About?" She exhaled slowly. "Fighting you was useless." She squeezed his hand lightly, watching the way his throat bobbed. "I was scared, William. Not just of you, of everything. My life, my future. But now, I don't want to run anymore." A pause. Then she lifted his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles. Checkmate. Something in William snapped. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, eyes burning. Sarah's breath hitched as he pulled her up roughly, his grip bruising. "You're mine," he rasped. She lifted her chin. "Yes." His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, his breath hot against her lips. "Say it again." "You," she whispered. "Own me. Lie. Lie. Lie." But William believed it, and that meant she had him exactly where she wanted him, the moment of weakness. That night, as William slept beside her, Sarah finally moved. Silently, she slipped out of bed, padding barefoot toward his office. Everything she needed was in there. Evidence, bank records, contacts, weaknesses. She had spent months trying to escape William Blackthorne. But if she wanted true freedom, she couldn't just run. She had to destroy him first. She sat at his desk, turned on his computer, and started typing. Because in the end, William had made one fatal mistake. He thought she was his. But soon, very soon, he would learn the truth. Sarah. Kim belonged to no one. The fall begins. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Everything William owned, his company, his wealth, his power, was one wrong move away from collapsing. And she was going to be the one to do it. She scrolled through encrypted files, bank statements, offshore accounts, secrets only a man like William Blackthorne could have, illegal acquisitions, untraceable money transfers, dirty deals buried beneath layers of deception. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. If she exposed this, William would lose everything. Her finger hovered over the download button. Then a shadow fell over her. Sarah. The voice was low, dangerous. Her breath froze. Slowly, so slowly, she turned around. William stood in the doorway, shirt unbuttoned at the top, sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, burning, calculating, suspicious. "What?" he said, stepping forward. "Are you doing?" Sarah's pulse exploded. Think, think, think. She forced herself to swallow her fear and gave him a soft, innocent smile. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "I thought I'd go through your work, learn more about you." A beat of silence. Then he moved. In a flash, he was in front of her, his hands caging her against the desk, his breath warm against her cheek. "You expect me to believe that?" His voice was low, a warning. Sarah didn't blink. "Why wouldn't you?" William's fingers traced her jaw, his touch deceptively gentle. "Because, my little liar, you're up to something." Her stomach clenched. But she tilted her head, letting her lips brush his wrist as if she wanted him closer. "Maybe I'm just finally giving in," she whispered. Another lie. William smirked. "Are you?" His hand slid into her hair, tilting her head back, forcing her to meet his gaze. Then he leaned in, his lips grazing her ear. "Or," he murmured, "are you trying to destroy me?" Her blood turned to ice. The web of lies. Sarah knew she had seconds to act. She couldn't let him see the truth, so she did the only thing she could. She kissed him. Hard. It wasn't soft. It wasn't hesitant. It was desperate. A calculated move to distract him, to make him believe she wanted this. For a second, just a second, William froze. Then, a low growl rumbled in his chest, and suddenly, he was kissing her back. The control she thought she had, gone. His hands tightened around her waist, pulling her in, claiming, demanding. Sarah could barely breathe, barely think, until he suddenly pulled away. His gaze was wild, dark, unpredictable. "You're lying to me," he whispered. Sarah's stomach dropped. "You're playing a game," William continued, voice like steel. "And you think I can't see it?" He stepped back. Sarah didn't dare move. Then, slowly, William reached into his pocket and pulled out her phone. Her heart stopped. Her phone. The one she had hidden in the desk drawer. The one she had planned to use to send all his secrets to the press. He held it up, turning it between his fingers. "Tell me, Sarah," he murmured. "Who were you planning to send this to?" Her entire body went cold. She had lost. He knew. The last escape Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at her phone in William's hand. He knew. He knew everything. But if she panicked now, she was dead. Her mind raced. "Think, Sarah. Think." She slowly licked her lips, forcing her body to stay still. "Do you really think I'd be that stupid?" she whispered. William tilted his head, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "Enlighten me." She exhaled shakily, pretending to relax. "I knew you'd go through my things, William. I left my phone there on purpose." His grip on the device tightened. "You're lying." Sarah shrugged. "Am I?" She met his gaze, holding it. "I wanted to see if you still doubted me, if you still thought I was trying to betray you." She slowly reached out and took the phone from his fingers, and he let her. She lifted it up, showing him the screen. "Go ahead, check it." William's jaw clenched, but he didn't move, because now he was the one hesitating. If he was wrong, if she really had been testing him, then he would have doubted her loyalty for nothing. It would make him weak, vulnerable, and William Blackthorne never liked feeling weak. Sarah saw the exact moment the doubt crept into his mind. Checkmate. She exhaled softly, stepping closer. "I told you," she whispered. "I've stopped fighting you." She placed a gentle hand on his chest, feeling his heart pounding. "Do you believe me now?" William didn't answer. His hands twitched at his sides, as if he didn't know what to do with them. For once, he was the one hesitating. And Sarah? She had one final chance. She lifted herself onto her toes, leaning in as if to kiss him. And then, with all the strength, she had left. She brought her knee up, straight into his stomach. William gasped, stumbling back. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy paperweight, and smashed it against his head. A grunt of pain. A curse. And then, he dropped. Sarah didn't look back. She ran. Nowhere. Left to run. Sarah didn't stop running until she was out of the penthouse, down the emergency stairs, and into the freezing night air. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred. But she was free. For the first time in months, she was free. Except, her stomach twisted. It was too easy. Too easy. William Blackthorne wasn't a man who lost. He wasn't a man who let go. Sarah had gotten away. But for how long? As she ran into the dark streets, her breath uneven, one thought consumed her. This isn't over. Not even close. The guilt that changed everything. Sarah gripped the edges of the sink in the hospital bathroom, her knuckles turning white. What had she done? She had wanted to escape him, to be free. But when she saw him lying there, blood seeping from his head, unmoving, vulnerable. She had panicked. She had called an ambulance, and now she was here, stuck in this nightmare all over again. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. At least he was alive. She could leave now. She turned toward the exit, only to be stopped by a nurse running toward her. "Ma'am," the woman was breathless. "Your boyfriend is awake." Sarah blinked. "Boyfriend? He's not my boyfriend," she snapped. The nurse gave her a confused look. "The doctor wants to speak with you." "He doesn't belong to me," Sarah insisted. "If the doctor wants to talk, he can go talk to himself." The nurse hesitated, then sighed. "Ma'am, his condition is serious. You should at least hear the doctor out." Sarah hesitated. Something uneasy curled in her stomach. With a reluctant sigh, she followed the nurse down the cold, sterile hallway. And when she stepped into the doctor's office, she felt her entire world tilt. The doctor looked grim. "Miss Kim, William Blackthorne has suffered a significant head injury. His brain trauma has led to severe memory loss." Sarah's breath caught. "Memory loss?" "He doesn't remember anything," the doctor confirmed. "For now, he won't be able to work. His condition is fragile. He might need someone to take care of him." Sarah felt sick. William Blackthorne, the man who had tormented her, stalked her, obsessed over her, had no idea who he was. No idea who she was. For the first time, he was helpless. And for the first time, he wasn't a monster. The new William days turned into weeks. Sarah never meant to stay. She told herself she would leave, but guilt kept her by his side. At first, he was cold, distant, staring at her as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "Who am I to you?" he had asked one night, his voice quiet. Sarah had swallowed. "You were my boss. That was the safest truth." He had frowned. "Was I good to you?" Sarah had forced a smile. "You were difficult." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That sounds about right, but this William was different. He wasn't cruel. He didn't demand or intimidate. Instead, he was gentle, patient, kind." The man who once owned her life now clung to her for support, watching her with wide, desperate eyes, as if she was his only anchor. And slowly, Sarah's heart betrayed her. She started to see the man behind the obsession. She started to care. She started to fall. The night. She gave in. The storm raged outside, wind rattling against the windows, but inside, the room was warm. Too warm. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering as William stood in front of her, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He had been so different these past few weeks. Gentle, patient, not the man who had once tormented her. And now, standing before her in nothing but loose pajama pants, his body tense with restrained emotion, he looked more human than ever. More. "Vulnerable, Sarah," he murmured, voice husky, hesitant. "I don't remember anything from before. But if I ever hurt you, I'm sorry." Her chest tightened. Wasn't this what she had wanted? For him to feel remorse? She should have pulled away. She should have reminded herself of the past. But as his fingers brushed against her cheek, trailing down to her jaw. Something inside her cracked. She leaned into his touch, her breath hitching. "You didn't always hurt me," she whispered. It was the closest thing to forgiveness she could offer. Something flickered in his eyes. A silent battle. "Then let me do this right," he murmured, his fingers tilting her chin upward. And then he kissed her. It was slow at first, achingly slow, as if he was memorizing every movement, every gasp that left her lips. His hands traced down her arms, gently, reverently, as if she was something fragile, something precious. Sarah's pulse raced. This wasn't the William she had feared. This was a man who was letting her lead. His lips moved against hers, deepening the kiss, his tongue sweeping over hers in a way that made her knees weak. She gripped his shoulders, feeling the way his body shuddered beneath her touch. "Sarah," he whispered against her lips. "Tell me to stop." But she didn't. She couldn't. Her hands moved of their own accord, slipping beneath the fabric of his shirt, feeling the warmth of his skin. A sharp intake of breath, and then something shifted. The tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped. William groaned, lifting her into his arms, pressing her against the mattress as his body settled over hers. His hands roamed down, slow, teasing, worshipping. He kissed along her jaw, down the column of her neck, lingering at the spot that made her breath hitch. Her fingers tangled in his hair as his lips continued their descent. The way he touched her, possessive yet careful, made something deep inside her tremble. "Tell me what you need," he rasped, his voice thick with restraint. She swallowed, her body burning. "You," she admitted. "Just you." A curse left his lips before he captured hers again, devouring, desperate, lost. And when they finally gave in to each other, it wasn't just physical. It was something more, something dangerous. Because Sarah had convinced herself she hated William Blackthorne. But that night, as he held her like she was his entire world, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She had fallen for him. The truth unraveled. Sarah woke up, tangled in the sheets. William's arm wrapped tightly around her waist. The memories of the night before flooded her mind. She had given in. She had let herself love him. A small, hesitant smile tugged at her lips as she turned to look at him. But then, something cold settled in her stomach. A nagging feeling. Something wasn't right. Carefully, she slid out of bed, tiptoeing across the room to where his phone lay on the nightstand. Her heart pounded as she unlocked it. And then, her blood ran cold. There it was. A message to his doctor. She believes everything. Continue as planned. Her fingers shook. No. No. No, no. He hadn't lost his memory. He had been lying. Every soft moment. Every gentle touch. Every whispered apology. All of it. A manipulation. A choked sob caught in her throat. She turned, horror coursing through her veins, only to find William, awake, watching her, calm, unbothered, like he had been waiting for her to find out. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice deep and almost amused. She clutched the phone, trembling. "You lied to me," she whispered. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Her stomach churned with disgust. She had slept with him. She had trusted him. And the entire time he had been playing her. She felt sick. "Get away from me," she hissed, stepping back. William's gaze darkened, but he didn't move. "You don't mean that," he said smoothly. "You let me touch you. Let me have you. You don't hate me, Sarah. You never did." She slapped him. The sound echoed through the room. He didn't even flinch, but something in his eyes shifted. Sarah's breath was shaky. "I will never forgive you for this." A slow, dangerous smirk. "Then hate me all you want, but you're still mine." "Not anymore." Sarah spun on her heel and ran. She ran just like before, only this time, she wouldn't look back. The final betrayal and the ultimate escape. Sarah ran. Barefoot, barely dressed, she grabbed her coat and fled down the hospital hallway, heart pounding like a war drum. She didn't look back, didn't stop to think. Because if she did, she'd break. The man she had trusted, loved, surrendered to, had played her like a game. She burst through the hospital doors, the cold night air biting her skin. The city stretched ahead of her, vast and indifferent. She had nowhere to go. No job, no money, no freedom. Because William Blackthorne had taken it all. And the worst part? She had let him. She needed help, and there was only one person who might still care enough to save her. Sarah pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and dialed. After 3 rings, "Sarah?" Mia's voice came through the line, sleepy but instantly alert. Sarah choked back a sob. "Mia, I need you." A pause, then firm and unhesitating. "Where are you?" 30 minutes later. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Mia's car, wrapped in a blanket, her entire body still shaking. Mia glanced at her, fury darkening her features. "I knew something was wrong when you disappeared for weeks. That man, he did something, didn't he?" Sarah's throat closed up. I was stupid. I fell for it. I let myself think he could change." She clenched her fists. "But he was just pretending. He never lost his memory. He was watching me suffer and enjoying it." Barefoot, barely dressed, she grabbed her coat and fled down the hospital hallway, heart pounding like a war drum. She didn't look back, didn't stop to think, because if she did, she'd break. The man she had trusted, loved, surrendered to, had played her like a game. She burst through the hospital doors, the cold night air biting her skin. The city stretched ahead of her, vast and indifferent. She had nowhere to go, no job, no money, no freedom, because William Blackthorne had taken it all. And the worst part? She had let him. She needed help, and there was only one person who might still care enough to save her. Sarah pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and dialed. After 3 rings, "Sarah?" Mia's voice came through the line, sleepy but instantly alert. Sarah choked back a sob. "Mia, I need you." A pause, then firm and unhesitating. "Where are you?" 30 minutes later, Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Mia's car, wrapped in a blanket, her entire body still shaking. Mia glanced at her, fury darkening her features. "I knew something was wrong when you disappeared for weeks. That man, he did something, didn't he?" Sarah's throat closed up. I was stupid. I fell for it. I let myself think he could change." She clenched her fists. "But he was just pretending. He never lost his memory. He was watching me suffer and enjoying it." Mia's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "That sick bastard." Sarah swallowed, her mind racing. "He's never going to let me go," she whispered. Mia's jaw clenched. "Then we make sure he does." Sarah blinked. "What?" Mia turned to her, eyes blazing. "Sarah, it's time to stop running. You don't just escape men like William Blackthorne." Her voice dropped lower. "You destroy them." The trap is set for 3 days. Sarah disappeared. No calls, no movement, no trace. For the first time, she turned the game around. And William Blackthorne, he felt it. The absence. The loss. The way the world suddenly felt. Wrong. He had underestimated her. And now, she was slipping away. He wouldn't allow it. So he hunted her. The invitation arrived on the 4th night. An anonymous message delivered. To Blackthorne Enterprises. Come alone. Midnight. You'll know where. William read it, heart pounding. He knew exactly where. The penthouse. Their penthouse. The place where she had given herself to him, and the place where he would take her back. Midnight. William entered the penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the darkened space. His footsteps echoed. He knew she was here, watching, waiting. Sarah, he called, voice calm, controlled, dangerous. A sharp click, the lamp on the far end of the room flickered on, and there she was, standing tall, dressed in black, eyes colder than he had ever seen. But what froze him wasn't her expression. It was the gun in her hand, pointed directly at him. William stilled. Sarah, he said, voice quieter this time. Her grip on the gun didn't waver. You've taken everything from me, she whispered. A beat of silence. Then, a smirk ghosted over his lips. And yet, he murmured, stepping closer, you still can't pull the trigger. Her breath hitched, because he was right. No matter how much she hated him, she couldn't kill him, and he knew it. His eyes softened. Sarah, you're mine. A single tear slipped down her cheek. No, she whispered. I'm no one's. And then, she turned the gun, aimed at the window, and fired. The glass shattered, shards flying as the icy wind roared in. William's body tensed. Sarah. But she was already running, straight for the edge, straight for freedom. His heart stopped. Sarah! She leapt, and for a moment, just a second, he thought he had lost her forever. But as he rushed to the window, he saw it. A rope, dangling, from the rooftop below, and at the end of it, Sarah, escaping. His breath caught. She looked up, met his gaze, and then she cut the rope. The fall of William Blackthorne. She was gone. For the first time in his life, William Blackthorne lost, and it destroyed him. The next day, everything crumbled. His company, his reputation, his empire. Sarah had planned it all, exposed his crimes, frozen his accounts. She had taken everything from him, just as he had done to her. And William? He just let it happen. Because without her, nothing else mattered. 1 year later, the sun was warm, the ocean breeze soft. Sarah sat at a cafe sipping her coffee, watching the waves crash against the shore. She was free. For the first time in years, she was truly free. A shadow fell over her table. She froze. Slowly, she looked up, and there he was. William Blackthorne, dressed simply. No suit, no power. Just a man who had lost everything, a man who had let her win. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no obsession, no control, no chase, just quiet, raw regret. Sarah's heart clenched. She hated him. She had loved him. And now, she simply let him go. She turned away, and William Blackthorne, he walked away. For the first time, he didn't follow. The end.